Chapter 16. Jem heard me. He thrust his head around the connecting door. As he came to my bed, Atticus's light flashed on. We stayed where we were until it went off. We heard him turn over, and we waited until he was still again. Jem took me to his room and put me in bed beside him. Try to go to sleep, he said. It'll be all over after tomorrow, maybe. We'd come in quietly so as not to wake Auntie. Atticus killed the engine in the driveway and coasted to the car house. We went in the back door and to our rooms without a word. I was very tired and was drifting into sleep when the memory of Atticus calmly folding his newspaper and pushing back his hat became Atticus standing in the middle of an empty waiting street pushing up his glasses. The full meaning of the night's events hit me and I began crying. Jem was awfully nice about it. For once, he didn't remind me that people nearly 9 years old didn't do things like that. Everyone's appetite was delicate this morning, except Jem's. He ate his way through 3 eggs. Atticus watched in frank admiration. Aunt Alexandra sipped coffee and radiated waves of disapproval. Children who slipped out at night were a disgrace to the family. Atticus said he was right glad his disgraces had come along. But Auntie said nonsense. Mr. Underwood was there all the time. You know, it's a funny thing about Braxton, said Atticus. He despises Negroes, won't have one near him. Local opinion held Mr. Underwood to be an intense, profane little man, whose father, in a fit of humor, christened Braxton Bragg, a name Mr. Underwood had done his best to live down. Atticus said naming people after Confederate generals made slow, steady drinkers. Calpurnia was serving Aunt Alexandra more coffee, and she shook her head at what I thought was a pleading, winning look. You're still too little, she said. I'll tell you when you ain't. I said it might help my stomach. All right, she said, and got a cup from the side cupboard. She poured 1 tablespoon of coffee into it and filled the cup to the brim with milk. I thanked her by sticking out my tongue at it and looked up to catch Auntie's warning frown. But she was frowning at Atticus. She waited until Calpurnia was in the kitchen. Then she said, Don't talk like that in front of them. Talk like what? In front of whom? He asked. Like that in front of Calpurnia. You said Braxton Underwood despises Negroes right in front of her. Well, I'm sure Cal knows it. Everybody in Maycomb knows it. I was beginning to notice a subtle change in my father these days that came out when he talked to Aunt Alexandra. It was a quiet digging in, never outright irritation. There was a faint starchiness in his voice when he said, Anything fit to say at the tables, fit to say in front of Calpurnia. She knows what she means to this family. I don't think it's a good habit, Atticus. It encourages them. You know how they talk amongst themselves. Everything that happens in this town's out to the quarters before sundown. My father put down his knife. I don't know of any law that says they can't talk. Maybe if we didn't give them so much to talk about, they'd be quiet. Why don't you drink your coffee, Scout? I was playing in it with a spoon. I thought Mr. Cunningham was a friend of ours. You told me a long time ago he was. He still is. But last night he wanted to hurt you. Atticus placed his fork beside his knife and pushed the plate aside. Mr. Cunningham's basically a good man, he said. He just has his blind spots along with the rest of us. Jem spoke. Don't call that a blind spot. He'd have killed you last night when we first went there. He might have hurt me a little, Atticus conceded. But, son, you'll understand folks a little better when you're older. A mob's always made up of people, no matter what. Mr. Cunningham was part of a mob last night, but he was still a man. Every mob in every little southern town is always made up of people you know. Doesn't say much for them, does it? I'll say not, said Jem. So it took an 8-year-old child to bring him to their senses, didn't it, said Atticus. That proves something, that a gang of wild animals can be stopped, simply because they're still human. Maybe we need a police force of children. You children last night made Walter Cunningham stand in my shoes for a minute. That was enough. Well, I hope Jem would understand folks a little better when he was older. I wouldn't. First day Walter comes back to school, it'll be his last, I affirmed. You will not touch him, Atticus said flatly. I don't want either of you bearing a grudge about this thing, no matter what happens. You see, don't you, said Aunt Alexandra, what comes of things like this. Don't say I haven't told you. Atticus said he'd never say that, pushed out his chair and got up. There's a day ahead, so excuse me, Jem. I don't want you and Scout downtown today, please. As Atticus departed, Dill came bounding down the hall into the dining room. It's all over town this morning, he announced. All about how we held off 100 folks with our bare hands. Aunt Alexandra stared into silence. It was not 100 folks, she said, and nobody held anybody off. It was just a nest of those Cunninghams, drunk and disorderly. Aw, Auntie, that's just Dill's way, said Jem. He signals for us to follow him. You all stay in the yard today, she said, as we made our way to the front porch. It was like Saturday. People from the south end of the county passed our house in a leisurely but steady stream. Mr. Dolphus Raymond lurched by on his thoroughbred. Don't see how he stays in the saddle, murmured Jem. How can you stand to get drunk before 8 in the morning? A wagon load of ladies rattled past us. They wore cotton sunbonnets and dresses with long sleeves. A bearded man in a wool hat drove them. Yonder's some Mennonites, Dill said to Jem. They don't have buttons. They live deep in the woods, did most of their trading across the river, and rarely came to Maycomb. Dill was interested. They've all got blue eyes, Jem explained, and the men can't shave after they marry. Their wives like for 'em to tickle 'em with their beards. Mr. X. Billups rode by on a mule and waved to us. He's a funny man, said Jem. X is his name, not his initial. He was in court one time and they asked him his name. He said X. Billups. Clerk asked him to spell it and he said X. Asked him again and he said X. They kept at it till he wrote an X on a sheet of paper and held it up for everybody to see. They asked him where he got his name and he said that's the way his folks signed him up when he was born. As the county went by us, Jem gave Dill the histories and general attitudes of the more prominent figures. Mr. Tensaw Jones voted the straight prohibition ticket. Miss Emily Davis dipped snuff in private. Mr. Byron Waller could play the violin, and Mr. Jake Slade was cutting his third set of teeth. A wagon load of unusually stern-faced citizens appeared. When they pointed to Miss Maudie Atkins's yard, ablaze with summer flowers, Miss Maudie herself came out on the porch. It was an odd thing about Miss Maudie. On her porch, she was too far away from us to see her features clearly, but we could always catch her mood by the way she stood. She was now standing arms akimbo, her shoulders drooping a little, her head cocked to one side, her glasses winking in the sunlight. We knew she wore a grin of the uttermost wickedness. The driver of the wagon slowed down his mules, and in a shrill-voiced woman called out, "He that cometh in vanity departeth in darkness." Miss Maudie answered, "A merry heart maketh a cheerful countenance." I guess that the foot washers thought that the devil was quoting scripture for his own purposes as the driver speeded his mules. Why they objected to Miss Maudie's yard was a mystery, heightened in my mind because for someone who spent all the daylight hours outdoors, Miss Maudie's command of scripture was formidable. "You going to court this morning?" asked Jem. We had strolled over. "I am not," she said. "I have no business with the court this morning." "Aren't you going down to watch?" asked Dill. "I am not. It's morbid watching a poor devil on trial for his life. Look at all those folks. It's like a Roman carnival." "They have to try him in public, Miss Maudie," I said. "Wouldn't be right if they didn't." "I'm quite aware of that," she said. "Just because it's public, I don't have to go, do I?" Miss Stephanie Crawford came by. She wore a hat and gloves. She said. "Look at all those folks. You'd think William Jennings Bryan was speaking." "And where are you going, Stephanie?" inquired Miss Maudie. "To the Jitney Jungle." Miss Maudie said she'd never seen Miss Stephanie go to the Jitney Jungle in a hat in her life. "Well," said Miss Stephanie, "I thought I just might look in at the courthouse to see what Atticus is up to." "Better be careful he doesn't hand you a subpoena." We asked Miss Maudie to elucidate, and she said Miss Stephanie seemed to know so much about the case she might as well be called on to testify. We held off until noon when Atticus came home for dinner and said they'd spent the morning picking the jury. After dinner, we stopped by for Dill and we went to town. It was a gala occasion. There was no room in the public hitching rail for another animal. Mules and wagons were parked under every available tree. The courthouse square was covered with picnic parties sitting on newspapers, washing down biscuits and syrup with warm milk from fruit jars. Some people were gnawing on cold chicken and cold fried pork chops. The more affluent chased their food with drugstore Coca-Cola and bulb-shaped soda glasses. Greasy-faced children popped the whip through the crowd. The babies lunched at their mother's breasts. In the far corner of the square, the Negroes sat quietly in the sun, dining on sardines, crackers, and the more vivid flavors of Nahi Cola. Mr. Dolphus Raymond sat with them. "Jem," said Dill, "he's drinking out of a sack." Mr. Dolphus Raymond seemed to be doing so. 2 yellow drugstore straws ran from his mouth to the depths of a brown paper bag. "Ain't ever seen anybody do that," murmured Dill. "How does he keep what's in there?" Jem giggled. "He's got a Coca-Cola bottle full of whiskey in there. That's so's not to upset the ladies. You'll see him sip it all afternoon. He'll step out for a while and fill it back up. Why is he sitting with the colored folks?" "Always does. He likes 'em better'n he likes us, I reckon. Lives by himself way down near the county line. He got a colored woman and all sorts of mixed children. Show you some of 'em if we see 'em." "He doesn't look like trash," said Dill. "He's not. He owns all one side of the riverbank down there, and he's from a real old family to boot." "Then why does he do like that?" "That's just his way," said Jem. "They say he never got over his wedding. He was supposed to marry one of those Spencer ladies, I think. They were going to have a huge wedding, but they didn't. After the rehearsal, the bride went upstairs and blew her head off. Shotgun. She pulled the trigger with her toes." "Did they ever know why?" "No," said Jem. "Nobody ever quite knew why but Mr. Dolphus. They said it was because she found out about his colored woman. He reckoned he could keep her and get married, too. He's been sort of drunk ever since. You know, though, he's real good to those chillin'." "Jem," I asked, "what's a mixed child?" "Half white, half colored. You've seen him, Scout. You know that red, kinky-headed one that delivers for the drugstore? He's half white. They're real sad." "Sad? How come?" They don't belong anywhere. Colored folks won't have them because they're half white. White folks won't have them because they're colored. So they're just in-betweeners. They don't belong anywhere. But Mr. Dolphus now, they say he shipped 2 of his up north. They don't mind 'em up north. Yonder's one of 'em." A small boy clutching a Negro woman's hand walked toward us. He looked all Negro to me. He was rich chocolate with flaring nostrils and beautiful teeth. Sometimes he would skip happily, and the Negro woman tugged his hand to make him stop. Jem waited until they passed. "That's one of the little ones," he said. "How can you tell?" asked Dill. "He looked all black to me." "He can't sometimes, not unless you know who they are. But he's half Raymond, all right." "But how can you tell?" I asked. "I told you, Scout, you just have to know who they are." "Well, how do you know we ain't Negroes?" "Uncle Jack Finch says we really don't know. He says as far back as he can trace back the Finches we ain't. But for all he knows, we might have come straight out of Ethiopia during the Old Testament." "Well, if we came out during the Old Testament, it's too long ago to matter." "That's what I thought," said Jem. "But around here, you have a drop of Negro blood, that makes you all black. Hey, look." Some invisible signal had made the lunchers in the square rise and scatter bits of newspaper, cellophane, and wrapping paper. Children came to mothers, babies were cradled on hips, and men in sweat-stained hats collected their families and herded them through the courthouse door. In the far corner of the square, the Negroes and Mr. Dolphus Raymond stood up and dusted their breeches. There were few women and children among them, which seemed to dispel the holiday mood. They waited patiently at the doors behind the white families. "Let's go in," said Dill. "Nah, we better wait till they get in. Atticus might not like it if he sees us."